So thank you again for being here. We are on chapter 11 of 15. So be thinking if there's something else that you want to go through next time, or we could just go through the book of the Bible. I would like to find something that is accessible to everyone, preferably for free, because we like free. And there's free books and PDFs and things like that that we can use in the future. But we are on chapter 11, and let me pull up the PowerPoint for tonight. And it is, put this up here, the kingdom of heaven, which in a way we've been talking about all along anyway, right? The kingdom of heaven is like this. And this starts off from Matthew 5, verses 19 and 20. And if you're following along, when we get to the thoughts of the mounts of blessing passages, it's going to be from parts of chapter 3. And we'll show you where those are. That'll be our next one. So before we start, because I'm getting discombobulated already, let's start with a word of prayer. Dennis, could you pray for us to get us started?
Sure. Lord Jesus, thank you for this time that we have together to learn more about you. Guide us as we read and talk together, and just make this time together a blessing for all. I ask in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so we're starting off with chapter 11, Kingdom of Heaven, and who would like to read the first couple of slides?
I can.
Okay, go for it.
It had been a confusing morning for the disciples. Oops, I forgot to move. Sorry. Before they met the crowd, they had spent some quality time with Jesus. They didn't realize it, but he had been praying for them through the night. His time was growing short, and with their limited education and long years of listening to the Pharisees, they had much to learn. That morning, before the sun rose, Jesus gathered them into a circle around him. As he spoke of the work they would do and encouraged them to do it faithfully, he placed his hands on each of their heads in turn. He prayed and blessed them, asking his Father to give them understanding. He asked his Father to give them courage to light the world with his message and his love. In doing this, Jesus dedicated each of his disciples to the work of sharing his gospel that day and every day for the rest of their lives. Then they left the quiet spot where they had slept and prayed and walked down to the lakeshore where the crowd was already gathering. Among the peasants, fishermen, and merchants were the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders of their country. Looking out into their eyes, the disciples were confused. These Jewish leaders accused Jesus and the disciples of being sinners because they ignored so many of the rituals and ceremonies that the rabbis said were required by God. They had spent their whole lives trying to live up to what the Pharisees demanded. But now Jesus said that their demands were not important. Jesus wrong, or were they Pharisees wrong? Whoops.
Hold on one second. It sounds like we've got an echo. Let me see if I can see whose it is.
Yeah, I'm getting the echo.
Yeah, I think it's you. I'm going to mute you for a little bit, Susan, okay?
You what?
I'm going to mute you for a little bit.
Oh, okay, sure.
All right. Keep going, Carol.
Okay. Oh, I think I finished. Was Jesus
okay? Yeah. So then we got next one. Who'd like to read this one? I think there's two more.
I can do it.
I heard Jill first.
Good.
Okay. Throughout the years, the Jewish nation had claimed to be God's chosen people, but everything Jesus said showed that their religion had no saving faith. These leaders have perfected their way of living by outwardly not breaking any of the laws they proclaimed to be of importance. But there was nothing inside of them. Their hearts held no kindness, no love for others. They were not like Jesus at all. Any religion based solely on keeping laws or acting right is not a religion that brings a person closer to God. Without love and kindness, it actually keeps people away. The only belief system that changes a person's life, that can transform a person's character, is a religion based on love. What Jesus was explaining that morning was what religion actually looks like when you follow God. He was trying to explain the lifestyle that he lived, caring for others and following God faithfully. Both the Pharisees and the disciples should have remembered what Jesus had taught through the Old Testament prophets. Jesus' teachings weren't new. They were a part of the message the prophets faithfully had recorded. Micah said, "What does God ask of you? To act fairly, to show kindness, to be humble before God."
All right, and that's where we go into the first of the two verses we're going to be looking at today. And it says, "Whosoever," or therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments, and this is, when Jesus was talking about last week, keeping the law, and teaches others accordingly, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. This can be a little bit unnerving, knowing that we don't always have the perfect understanding of God's commandments and teachings. So let's keep going and see what we have from Thoughts of the Mount of Blessings, and this is from pages 51 and 52, if you wanted to follow along there. Who would like to read these couple slides for me? I think there's 3 of them here.
I can do that.
Okay, thanks, Karen.
That is, he shall have no place therein, for he who willfully breaks one commandment does not, in spirit and truth, keep any of them. Whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. James 2:10. It is not the greatness of the act of disobedience that constitutes sin, but the fact of variance from God's expressed will in the least particular. For this shows that there is yet communion between the soul and sin. The heart is divided in its service. There is a virtual denial of God, a rebellion against the laws of his government.
Okay, you can keep going.
Were men free to depart from the Lord's requirements and to set up a standard of duty for themselves, there would be a variety of standards to suit different minds, and the government would be taken out of the Lord's hands. The will of man would be made supreme, and the high and holy will of God, his purpose of love toward his creatures, would be dishonored, disrespected. Whenever men choose their own way, they place themselves in controversy with God. They will have no place in the kingdom of heaven, for they are at war with the very principles of heaven. In disregarding the will of God, they are placing themselves on the side of Satan, the enemy of God and man. Not by one word, not by many words, but by every word that God has spoken shall man live.
All right, and this is the last slide before we get to our questions.
We cannot disregard one word, however trifling it may seem to us, and be safe. There is not a commandment of the law that is not for the good and happiness of man, both in this life and in the life to come. In obedience to God's law, man is surrounded as with a hedge and kept from the evil. He who breaks down this divinely erected barrier at one point has destroyed its power to protect him, for he has opened a way by which the enemy can enter to waste and ruin. By venturing to disregard the will of God upon one point, our first parents opened the floodgates of woe upon the world, and every individual who follows their example will reap a similar result. The love of God underlies every precept of his law, and he who departs from the commandment is working his own unhappiness and ruin.
Thank you, Karen. Before we get to our questions, any comments on what
I noticed Jesus blessed all his disciples, so that must have included Judas,
Yes. Yes.
even though he knew.
And he loved them all. He loved Judas the same as the others.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to attempt unmuting Susan, and we'll see if we still get our echo.
You are unmuted.
We do still get our echo, so I don't know if you have a speaker or something like that, Susan.
No, I'm just on the phone.
Yeah. Weird.
Do you still have it?
Yes, we do.
Go ahead and mute me again.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Any other thoughts?
Well,
Oh, I also noticed that Jesus said, if we break one commandment, we're breaking all of them. And I remember a sermon from my childhood, because we had a rather extraordinary preacher. I mean, all these years later, I still remember some of his sermons. And he talked about a father who went on a trip and left his son in charge, but he left instructions with the son to do some building while the father was gone. So when the father came back, the son said, "Yeah, I did everything you wanted, Dad." And the father looked, and the son had done the first piece of work the way the father had wanted it done, because the son said, "Yeah, that makes sense, I'll do that." And then, but with the other stuff, he didn't agree with it, and he made some changes along the way. And the father said, "You didn't obey me in anything, because it was just a coincidence that you approved of the way I had chosen the first task." And there was another thought there that's probably not coming back.
Well, if it comes back, let us
But-
know.
Well, it's the same basic principle, though, that goes with what Jesus said about obedience.
And then I think Peter had something he was going to say.
Hold on, I'm having technical difficulties.
They're the best kind.
My platform fell down. My
Did
contraption.
he say his classroom fell down?
Platform.
My contraption, my platform.
There you go.
Oh, contraption.
No, I was just gonna say that, you know, when you think about the first sin, which opened the kind of the floodgates of everything else that comes along, it wasn't like Adam and Eve murdered anybody or anything. It was just disobeying just in one little point. Well, it was a major point, but they could do anything they wanted except eat from that tree. And, you know, I think it just emphasizes what the lesson said, that, I mean, what we were just reading about, one little sin, you know, one sin kind of opens the floodgate. I was kind of, when I was brought up in the church, the Roman Catholic Church, we had different sins. We had venial sins, little sins, and we had cardinal sins. But when you think of what happened when sin entered our creation, I probably was taught that was more of a venial sin than a cardinal sin, because it's not like one of the great sins you think about, you know, murder and all these other kinds of things. But it is a profound thing to think about, just that one little thing opened the floodgates to all the sin and woe that's in our world today.
When I think about sin, Adam and Eve's sin wasn't eating the fruit.
No.
It was separation from God.
Right.
They chose to go away from God. Said, God, I can handle this by myself. Well, we don't need you.
And yet, how many times do we do that?
We do exactly the same thing every day.
But we don't always bring on the results.
Right.
So that leads us into our first question. What is it that constitutes sin? Why is it that breaking one commandment would make a person guilty of breaking all of them? So I'm going to give you, while you think about that, the official Greek definition of the word sin, which I'm sure some of you have heard. It's the idea of like an archery and you miss your mark. That is what that term is. So you're missing your bullseye, you're missing your mark. And that's what sin, that word actually means. And I don't know if that adds any bearing to what might constitute sin in your minds.
Is that the same that's used in the whole Bible? Every time it says sin, is that what it means?
In the New Testament, in Greek, yes.
Oh, in the New Testament, okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the Greek word.
Well, he boiled down the commandments basically to love God and to love one another. is the bottom line. So if you love somebody and they've asked you to do something, you would do what they ask. And that's basically when we don't do what is asked of us, we're saying that for whatever reason we can't do it. Now he says, I've given you the grace to be able to do that. But sometimes we either don't feel worthy or we don't feel like we need it, or we're just basically, I think we're just kind of caught unaware sometimes. And after the fact, it's like, oh man, I didn't really want to do that. You have to go back and recheck your gauges.
Maybe the sin is not walking with God, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly after God. And maybe that's where it all starts. Just like Adam and Eve, Adam and Eve wandered away. And Adam was soon to follow. And maybe that's what constitutes sin. Separation from God, but it's a willingness on our part to separate ourselves.
Right. The disciples still sinned after they started following God.
Yes.
After they started following Jesus. But as long as they stayed with Jesus, it wasn't sin.
I think anyone who
Wrap your head
breathes,
around that.
with the exception of Jesus, anyone who has breath will continue to sin. Part of our human nature. But that's not meant to be a crippling disappointment with ourselves. I know people who say, oh, I can't overcome something that means I don't love God enough. Or that means I can't be saved because I keep making the same mistake over and over again. And I think that's a little bit on the extreme side and doesn't quite accurately represent our fallen nature. But also the idea, thinking back to do fairly, love mercy, be just, walk humbly. How many times do we see that modeled in the world around us?
Yeah.
It really stands out when that happens, right? Right now, there's a huge call for justice with the murder of some Black men in police custody this week. Heartbreaking. Cries out for justice. Because when things that we expect to see justice, we see it being abused. And it's really easy to get upset and go in the exact same path. And does that do any good? Fighting evil with evil?
No.
No.
Right.
No.
Does that mean you stand by and do nothing? Finding that balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
I liked that one sentence that says there's not a commandment of the law that is not for our good and happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Man, I mean, that's the bottom line, is everything that he's asked of us is only going to bring about good results. It's only going to bring about good results if we can just wrap our heads around that.
Right, and that goes down to that second question. How is God's law a hedge that protects us from evil? What is the result of disregarding the will of God in a small way? And, well, yes, God's law is a hedge that protects us and wants our good. If we're following God's law, does that mean that we are not going to feel the impact of the evil around us? Are we exempt?
Can I use another plant to explain that?
Yes, you may.
A grapevine. If we disconnect ourselves from the vine, we're in big trouble.
Mhm.
Even if we do wrong, as long as we're connected to that vine, there's hope.
Right, and actually that's going to come up, another metaphor where the vine is coming up. Sophia, yes.
This is for the first question. I know we all sinners. We do sin. We don't. It could be small or large. We just have to ask for forgiveness. He's a forgiving God. We always have to remember to ask for forgiveness.
Yeah.
That's a,
No, it says is God's law a hedge that protects us from evil. Yes, it does. But there are examples in the Bible. You know, you think of Job as kind of the
Job,
quintessential, man who did everything right. But yet evil did affect him. He chose to take the high road, which is a lesson to all of us. But he wasn't totally. He could still have the effects of the harm. He wasn't protected from that. He had to go through it, like the verse says, when you're in the floods or when you're walking in the fire, you still have to go through it sometimes. So I think maybe the hedges says that, I will bring you through and be with you, but we're not necessarily protected from.
Right.
And some of it, I think, goes to the final end and the final evil and the final good, right?
Yeah.
Versus right here today, which is frustrating, but it's still hope.
When I was thinking that what you were saying, Jill, I thought of that we need to be like gold tried in the fire. So we need to go through those experiences and show how God can lead us, because we sure can't go through by ourselves.
Yeah.
So think, so what's the result of disregarding the will of God in a small way?
Is there a small way?
We've already seen it.
What was the biggest thing that, we talked about Judas earlier. What was the biggest thing that hurt Judas?
His pride.
Yeah, and I think too, his brokenness in that he couldn't see himself being forgiven for what he did. Right? That led to his death. And part of that is pride too, right? I know the way that this should go, so I'm going to force it to go because I have all the right answers. But Judas could have asked for forgiveness.
Well,
Would he have gotten it?
Yes.
Yes.
If he was sincere.
Right.
And
we don't know. He could have asked for forgiveness, right as he was hanging himself. We don't know. But it can be granted.
I was just reading this morning about Judas, and right up until the last day or two, he was trying to maneuver so he could be next to Christ in his kingdom. He hadn't given up on that.
Well, none of the disciples had really given up on that yet.
Yeah, I know, but I never thought of Judas being one to try to, oh my goodness.
Well, think about it. He didn't expect that Jesus would be hung on the cross.
Right.
He thought that he'd probably perform some great feat and get out of
Yeah, none of them did.
away from the military or the guards. I don't think he anticipated that this would happen.
So if we start, go ahead, Peter.
No, I said Judas wasn't alone. It was Peter that told Christ, you're not going to die. You're not going to do that.
That's right.
So it was all the there's all the feeling that finally we get the yoke of the Romans thrown off of us, and we become a great nation that we read about in the Old Testament again.
Judas was just trying to make it happen sooner.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
In my time, right?
that wasn't the kingdom that Jesus' kingdom wasn't the kingdom that he wanted.
No, I know.
The other thing to think about is when we disregard the will of God in a small way, it's easier to keep disregarding the will of God in small ways. And soon it becomes exponential. You know, the first time you do something that may be difficult, your conscience that you know you're not supposed to be doing, your conscience may get at you. But after a while, you can silence your conscience, or you can rationalize why something's right or wrong, right? Someone once likened it to golf. Anybody? I don't know if anybody plays golf. I know the theory behind it. So you're aiming for this hole, right? And so let's say you hit your golf ball, and instead of re-aiming and relining yourself up, you just continue where you're going and hit it that way. By the end, even if you're 1 degree off, you can be hundreds of miles off of where you need to be, right? So just one little detour, 1 little degree off can in the end be something huge, right?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we're going to go back to our next part. And this is Matthew 5:20, which is, I tell you that if you are no more obedient than the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, and remember, they thought that they were super obedient, right? You will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Those are some harsh words, right? To be more obedient than the teachers who put their whole self-worth on being obedient. So then this next section comes from the Easy Reader Version Blessings, pages 54 to 56, or you can follow along with Mount of Blessings, pages 53 to 55. And who might like to start reading this for us?
I can.
Okay, go for it, Ed.
The Jewish leaders accused Jesus and his disciples of being sinners because they ignored the rituals and ceremonies of the rabbis. Good job. This confused the disciples. They were accustomed to listening to and honoring these religious leaders. But Jesus exposed their religion and self-righteousness as worthless. The Jewish nation claimed to be God's chosen people, but Jesus showed that their religion had no saving faith. All their attempts to appear righteous, all their rituals and ceremonies, all their claims of living without breaking God's law did not make them holy. Their hearts were not pure. They were not kind and just. They were not like Jesus.
All right. You want to keep going, Ed?
Yep, I can. A religion based on keeping laws or rules doesn't bring a person into harmony with God. The Pharisees' hard, rigid belief system showed no kindness, forgiveness, or love. It was actually a barrier to sinners. It kept people away from God. Like salt that has lost its saltiness, the belief of the Jewish leaders did nothing to save the world from spoiling with sin. The only true religion is one that works to change people's hearts with love. That kind of religion can transform a person's character. The Jewish people should have learned all this from the teachings of the prophets. Hundreds of years earlier, the prophet Micah had addressed the same issue. You say, what can I bring with me when I come before the Lord, when I bow before the Lord, the God on high? Should I come before him with burnt offerings, with year-old calves? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 male sheep? Will he be pleased with 10,000 rivers of oil?
Anyone
The
want to
Lord
pick
has-
up? Or go ahead. Keep going,
The Lord
Ed.
has told you, human, what is good, and he has told you what he wants from you, to do what is right to other people, Love being kind to others. Love humbly, obeying your God. Micah 6:6-8. The prophet Hosea compared the Pharisees' type of religion to an empty vine that produces fruit only for itself. The righteousness of the Jewish leaders was the fruit of their efforts to keep the law according to their own ideas and for their own selfish benefit. Clearly, their righteousness could be no better than they were themselves. In trying to make themselves holy, they were trying to make a clean thing out of an unclean thing. God's law is as holy and perfect as He is. It shows humans what God's righteousness is like. Human nature is twisted and selfish, so it's impossible for human beings by their own power to keep God's law. The actions of a selfish heart are dirty with sin, and all the right things we have done are like filthy pieces of cloth.
All right, someone else want to pick up for this last slide?
Heresy reading from thoughts from the knowledge lesson.
The law is holy, but the Jews could not become holy by trying to keep it. So the followers of Jesus had to look for something different from what the Pharisees taught if they wanted to enter the kingdom of heaven. God gave them His Son, whose life was a perfect reflection of the law. If they would open their hearts and accept Jesus, then God would live in them. His love would transform them into someone like Jesus. They were intent on earning their own righteousness and would not stoop to learn about the righteousness of God. Jesus showed those who listen to Him what it means to keep the commandments. It means reflecting His character in their own lives and actions.
Thank you. Any thoughts about what we just read before we get to our questions?
Every time I read it, the part that I read about our righteousness, is filthy rags. We don't have any.
Right. Yeah.
One thing that resonated with me is the idea, the Pharisees felt that their religion would save them. And it's not our religion. There's no religion that has saving power, right?
No.
Right.
It's not about that. So what does have the saving power?
Who you know.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Good
Relationship.
You mean knowing me? Knowing me, is that what it is?
Sorry, but all apologies, but
yeah,
Make
it's nice
it
to know
plain,
you.
Peter.
it's not leading away, but it is not the true source.
Right.
You can't ride on your shirt tails.
No, it's about having a divine connection, right? Because you could know all the right people on this earth, supposedly,
Sure.
and be able to drop names left and right, but that's not gonna help.
Big
right?
deal.
Yeah.
Even if you're Abraham's seed.
Yep.
Exactly.
So the Pharisees and Jewish leaders appeared to the disciples to be righteous and holy. And I think, this happens to us too. We see people and we're like, oh, wow, they're probably so holy. Look at how they're carrying on. Look at how they behave. So when they appeared this way, why did the disciples think that way? And I kind of jumped the gun. Could we also be fooled into thinking certain people are righteous? Why and why not? Who might we think of?
Well, the conference president, certainly he must be a righteous man. He wouldn't be there if he weren't. Isn't that true?
Mm-hmm.
We've had scandals.
We have to.
How many years ago did we have to have a new election for a new GC
The
president?
General Conference president had to leave. Mm-hmm. So,
And if anyone would like to know the true story of why New England Memorial Hospital closed, I know someone who would tell you.
we'll save that for another time.
I'm not the one who would tell you.
No.
So it's not a position
No,
that
but
makes
things are not.
anybody
Things
holy.
are not.
Go ahead, Jill.
I'm just going to say things are not always as they appear, and they can be slanted. So we need to, basically, our eyes need to be on Jesus. You know, it's hard. I appreciate people who are in high offices, you know, and God tells us, you know, to respect the people who are in leadership roles, you know, and he says, basically, I put them there for a reason and a purpose. So we need to remember that. It's just that we don't place our hope or our salvation in these people.
Jill, exactly my thoughts. We work out our own salvation. The conference president doesn't do it for us.
And, you know, the higher in a position you go in anywhere, the higher the temptation, the more the responsibility, the farther you can fall.
Right.
So there may be temptations that they have that we would never have if we weren't in that position.
I think that's one of Satan's favorite methods. How the mighty have fallen. You know, if he can get an influential Christian leader to fall,
Yeah.
It makes his day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they say it's lonely at the top. And a lot of times when you're in leadership, you don't know the motives of people wanting to be around you. And you have to have that separation because of your position. So
I saw, go ahead, Ed.
In the ministry of healing, there's a sentence that it would be good for us to remember. It says, often prayer is solicited for those who are suffering from illness or adversity, but our prayers are most needed by the men entrusted with prosperity and influence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a couple things that I want to share that I heard. One was someone talking about women leaders being put on a pedestal. They said that just gives someone an opportunity to do an upskirt of you. It actually makes you more vulnerable sometimes. And then on the flip side, talking about how we can fool other people. I saw a meme that was talking about people being upset at possibly having to wear their masks to go back to church. And this is, why are you upset? You've been wearing masks for years to church.
Oh.
Right? Of course, that doesn't go for everybody, but often we want to put out our best appearance. We're not always comfortable being vulnerable with one another. We don't want people to know about what's in our closet. It's hard to open up and know that you're not going to get attacked for the things that are going on in your life and things that you, or whether someone is trustworthy in order to be able to share with them what you're going through or what has happened to you in the past. I'm not going to go into it, but Carol shared something this week that really touched the other women that she was talking to, but it takes vulnerability and trust to be able to do that, and knowing right time and right place.
There could be teardrops behind the mask.
I'm going to say most of us do at one time or another.
Yeah.
I think it's, I think what we don't hear enough in church and maybe in testimony time is that, and maybe it would be frowned upon, but if you were an elder or, you know, some official in the church and you admitted to the congregation that you struggle, you have struggles just like anyone else. And we don't, you know, that's being vulnerable, but we see very little of that, I think, and probably because we're afraid of what the response might be.
It shows that you're human.
Right.
I know exactly.
You know, it's like,
True, but
and there's a difference between sharing that you struggle and trying to sensationalize something, right?
Oh, right.
Yes,
Sure.
you don't want to boast. Yeah.
Right,
Boast
or to gossip about yourself or the people you're in, whatever situation is. But yeah, I think it's important for us to show that we all struggle, and what Ed struggles with, or what Dennis struggles with, what Jill, you know, where it's all going to be something different, and maybe we'll have some of the same struggles. But if my struggle is not the same as yours, it doesn't mean one is better than the other. Right. No one is more righteous than the other, because we all share how much righteousness of our own, Ed?
None.
Zero.
None.
Especially
Big fat
me.
0.
Worse than that, it's filthy.
Yeah. So this was an interesting thought that was brought out, that the Pharisees, who thought that their belief system was bringing them closer to God, actually became a barrier to sinners, which they were as well. Why was that so? And what can we do to be sure that we're not the same type of barrier to other people?
Well, they had the
Well,
holier than thou attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
So
that's almost the same thing I was going to say. So they stay in a superior position.
and they can't come down to meet anyone at their level, at a lower level, at wherever people are at. So they can't reach out to people.
They give them rules and stuff that was almost impossible to keep.
Yeah,
And they wanted them to keep them. They themselves couldn't keep them.
right. And we saw how that worked with the Gentiles and circumcision. Paul straightened them out.
I was at a seminar feels like a year and a half ago, but I think it was the beginning of March. And they were talking about, who did Jesus surround himself with? He surrounded himself with the unclean, the beggars, the sick, the poor. And when Jesus surrounded himself around those people, the Pharisees could still get in, right? People would move in part for the Pharisees to go through to get to Jesus. But if it had been the Pharisees that were surrounding Jesus, would the Pharisees actually move, or would people feel like they could ask the Pharisees to move in order to come close to Jesus? No.
But even the disciples had that same problem when it came to children.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Just keep him away. He's way too busy for these kids.
And what did Jesus say? You're right, guys, keep them away?
Yeah, right. He says, you want to be in heaven? Be like one of these kids.
Yeah, he's like, give me these kids instead of a bunch of you posers. The kids ask the questions that you're afraid to ask.
I think about when I think of this is one of Morris Menden's sermons. He got through preaching, and some of the saints had a real big problem with him talking the subject that he had. And they would, until they turned the lights off, they just couldn't keep giving him a hard time. And then when they turned the lights off, they started leaving. And Morris went off the platform and he says, these were the saints that were telling him what he did wrong. And he met a bad person. And that bad person was telling him how he couldn't be saved like these other people that came because he was too bad of a sinner. And the end of the thing, it was that he says, I wish there was more bad people around. Not so many saints. It's hard to save a saint. You come to save sinners.
Yeah, it's hard if you don't know that you need saving. Right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So the followers of Jesus needed something different than what the Pharisees had.
Amen.
Right? They knew it was unachievable. They knew it would tear them up, make them feel horrible about themselves. They needed something different, because what they had, didn't have any saving power whatsoever. So in spite of what we may have learned about the importance of keeping the commandments, because it's important, but also we can't do it.
Yeah, exactly.
But we need to do it. What do we need? Not what do we need to do, what do we need in order to keep them?
Sanctification and justification.
Those are big $20 words. Ed, explain them to me.
They are. One of the ways that a favorite preacher of mine spoke of justification is he came to God and he says, God, I did this sin and I am so sorry. And he was really repentant, and God says, I forgive you. Next week he came to God and says, God, I did it again. And God says, you did what again?
That's nice.
Mm.
If you've never done it before, how could you do it again? God forgets it.
Mhm.
It's done.
Nice.
So then explain sanctification to me.
Sanctification, that's even harder for me to say. Sanctification, I guess, is every hour, every minute, walking with God, keeping your mind on Him. And I read something this morning that says we think a whole lot about this earth and what's going on, and we need to spend less time thinking about the earth and spend more time thinking about heaven. So everything that we do and say all day, that's part of sanctification, but we need to do it with God leading us, God, Jesus in our hearts.
So I'm going to rephrase something you said and let me know if it's okay to say it this way.
Okay.
Instead of thinking about all the things on this earth, we think about the creator of this earth.
Well,
rather than heaven, because some people think of heaven and I'm like, oh cool, I get to pet tigers, you know, or hey, I'll be able to sing on key.
Which is the big cat. Did you notice she chose a big cat?
Yeah, of course. You've met me, right? So
well,
the creator of not just the place, the person in heaven.
I've had a lot of fun in my life. I've traveled quite a bit. I haven't been to foreign countries and stuff a lot, but I've seen some beautiful, beautiful country. And if I can imagine that and imagine having as much fun as I've had different times on this earth, and God is going to blow me away with what heaven has, I'm ready.
I think it might be too. The answer may be in that if Jesus says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." So if we, along with Ed said, we spend time with Jesus, we spend time in His Word, we will have a love for Jesus, a love for God, and a love for the grace that we've received, and that is the motivation to obey. That's the only real motivation that can be to obey. So I think I think Ed said that in a couple of those big terms, but that's what justification, that applies to everyone who's ever been born.
Exactly.
And sanctification, that's the willingness for God to come into our lives and to keep making us more and more into His likeness.
Right.
And I think that we have to have confidence in God. We need to be confident in Him because He's the one that can do it. We can't.
Yes.
We can't keep the commandments, but He can keep them.
Right. We shouldn't really even know. I mean, what does it say? Don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing.
Right.
I mean, we're not a good judge of evaluating ourselves. It's probably better left than that's the job for God to evaluate us. But you've often heard people might say to you, they might make some compliment, and you're like going, I don't know what they're talking about, But I think, people do tend to evaluate you sometimes, and it can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing, But ultimately, God is the one we should be concerned about how we're doing, if you will, or how our lives are going. God is the ultimate, and because He's the only one that can really fix us.
Just like Adam and Eve, He wants to walk with us every day.
Yeah,
He wants to spend time with us.
That's right.
And are we good judges of ourselves?
Absolutely not.
No.
We think we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're often
We're real
more
good judges of other people.
Yeah, and sometimes
yeah.
we harp on ourselves over things that no one else notices, right? So we love to judge other people. We love to judge ourselves on some things, and other things we don't want to judge ourselves on at all, right?
Sure.
And I think getting back to something that Carol said is having confidence that every time I can keep going back. When I fall into keeping a law for the wrong reason, when I fall into thinking I can do it on my own, when I fall and know that I didn't do it at all the way I should have, confidence that I can keep coming back, and God is not going to be mad at me for keep coming back.
Has God ever been mad at you, Christy?
No,
Oh, okay.
he may have been disappointed at times, but I don't think God's ever been mad in that way that I think of. Could be wrong, but that keeps me going. Anything else anyone wants to add as we're wrapping up? That is our last one, our last question for tonight.
Just that, we talked about there is a purpose for people who are leaders, and when they there's a reason most of them in the church, there's a reason most of them have gotten to where they are because of how they have lived. Not all, but I'm just saying that there's a purpose for having leaders, and there's a purpose for having those that that do the work or whatever, or do the behind the scenes and stuff too. We need both. We need all in our lives.
Right. So what happened if you had all generals and no infantrymen, right?
Exactly.
If you had all doctors and no nurses, it would just be chaos, as my nurse friends understand.
Or no essential workers. And
right.
That's a popular term right now.
Exactly.
Well, I think it's Paul's metaphor of the body, the hands and the feet and the eye and the ear and the nose, and the body of Christ. We need each other.
And I think too, this kind of brought out at the beginning, when you're looking at leaders or anybody who's looking up to you or looking towards you, what you teach other people is important as well. If you're intentionally not teaching something or teaching something contrary to God, and you've been convicted in your heart, and you're still teaching otherwise, there's also danger in that as well, leading people astray.
That was one of Jesus' strongest condemnations to the Pharisees. He was working them over pretty good, and then the lawyers said, well, you certainly are not talking about us. And Jesus said, woe to you lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter in yourselves, and those who were entering you hindered. So that was even a worse condemnation. You didn't accept the truth yourself, but you worked hard at preventing others from coming to the truth.
It was during that same type of situation where Jesus like, it'd be better if you tied a millstone around your neck and threw yourself into the ocean and drowned than you do this. So definitely.
Yeah. In the Jewish religion, I'm a wealth of Jewish trivia. And in the Jewish religion, it's considered a worse sin to cause another person to sin than to do it yourself. So that's sort of going on with the Pharisees.
Yeah.
Jill, were you going to say something?
I think that's kind of odd because Jewish people would hire people to turn their lights on and off.
Oh, the Sabbath goy, yeah.
Well, they did. They truly believe it's not for us. It's not for us. I've had Jewish people tell me, "What do you mean you don't eat bacon? That's not for you. That's only for us. You don't have to have all the restrictions that we have. Be glad."
Yeah, and we only eat shrimp when we're out. We don't bring it in the house. That's what some friends of ours say. That's Jewish people.
But it's okay for Muslims to eat shrimp, so it must be okay.
People can rationalize very well. I mean, they rationalize as well as we do.
Yes. Jill, was there something you were going to say?
One of the things I wanted to add about heaven was the greatest reason for being there, wanting to be there, is to be with God and Jesus forever.
Yes, right.
Yeah, the streets of gold are nice, but that's not why we're going there.
Yeah.
Say that again?
The streets of gold are nice, but not our reason for going to heaven.
That's just
a bonus.
That's just pavement.
Yeah, the New Jerusalem here on earth when God dwells with us at all times. That's it. It's God's presence. Next week we are doing No Room for Hate. Yeah, I almost wish this was this week, but No Room for Hate is next week, and we'll get into that one. That's Matthew 5, 22, and 24. I am going to stop our recording.